We might want to close that door, though, I think.
Okay.
Door. Why'd you get the door there?
We are live. Don't say anything that you don't want the whole world to know.
What's this? You've been watching Comey all day.
So they're bored of Comey. They might switch here and find out your deepest, darkest secrets. So we are actually, I'm not going to review much, actually less than usual this week, which is actually fortuitous because we had to start late. The reason I'm not reviewing much is because we started a new chapter last week. There weren't a lot of people here, so we're actually going to just start at the beginning of the chapter now. The basic lead into this chapter from the previous chapter, we're starting chapter 6, page 173 in the English. The lead into this chapter is from chapter 5. In chapter 5, basically, long story short of chapter 5 is that God expresses himself in a way of light. Light is the metaphor for God's expression. And light, basically, the advantage of light is that the expression of light is natural. It's not something that the luminary has to invest itself in, but rather something that happens naturally. Just like the sun naturally shines, and this is an advantage because God, it's an advantage because God doesn't have to directly involve himself in the creation of the world. Rather, it's a regular natural expression of God. But then we said, but the thing is that with things that express themselves in a way of light within the world, they don't have a choice in expressing themselves, right? We say the advantage is that it's natural, which means that you don't have to be invested in it. It's not like a teacher giving a class when God creates the world, so to speak. Rather, it's the natural expression of himself. It's like the sun shining, which means that you don't really say that God is caused by the world or God is dependent on the world, right? Rather, you say that the world is dependent purely on God, right? And if the world ceased to exist, it wouldn't make any difference to God. Just like if the entire universe, except for the sun, was removed, the sun would shine in exactly the same way, right? That's the idea. But the disadvantage of this is that this seems to happen naturally. In other words, it would seem to say that the world arises per se from God, rises necessarily from God. Just as the sun necessarily must, by nature of being the sun, express light, you would say that God, by nature of being God, naturally is forced to create the world, right? Which there are some ancient philosophies that hold of that opinion. Judaism obviously does not hold of that opinion. We hold that God creates everything willfully. God doesn't have to do anything. So because he's God, he has the advantage of both things. He has the advantage of he creates the world willfully and he's not forced to, but when he uses his will to create the world, how is it created? In a way like it's natural, that he's not invested in it, like the light expressing itself. And obviously these two advantages can only be had in God. In our world, these two things never occur together. Something is either like light, or it's like hashpah, it's like influence, it's like a tailored expression. By God, because he has none of the limitations of anything and the advantages of everything, he's not limited. He doesn't have the limitations of either of these things, and so he's able to express himself with the advantage of light and with the advantage of influence. He is able to create the world willfully and yet not be invested in it, not be invested in that expression. That's basically where we're holding going into chapter 6. Chapter 6, the beginning of chapter 6 we spoke about last week, how it's basically Kabbalah 101, which is very exciting, even though Ronnie missed it. That's why we're going to do it again. So, some of us here love Kabbalah. So basically, at the beginning of chapter 6 here, the larger thing that we're in the middle of discussing, we're going to get around eventually to, is how the light and the vessels unite with one another, right? But we're quite removed from that conversation, so we'll worry about that when we get back to it, right? The beginning of chapter 6 describes the classic Kabbalistic explanation, according to the Arizal's Kabbalah, which is the Kabbalah that Chassidus is based on, that Chassidus Chabad is centered around, is the Kabbalah of the Arizal. The Arizal is basically like, in the eyes of Chassidus at least, he is the authority on Kabbalah. He is the if you're serious about Kabbalah, you don't argue with the Arizal. That is why Chassidus is based around the Arizal's Kabbalah. And the Arizal's Kabbalah gives a description of how the world is created, right? We know there's a story in Genesis, right, at the beginning of Bereshit, of how the world is created. That process has a spiritual root. The story of creation has a process to it. The way it's described in Genesis, at least in the very first act of creation, in the first verse, where it says, "In the beginning God created heaven and the earth," right? That act seems to arise spontaneously, and basically everything is created all at once, right? And then according to certain opinions, then all the other utterances were merely differentiating the initial creation, right? Everything was created in some sort of potential state, and then all of the other things like "let there be light" was actually taking from that potential and making an actual creation out of all those different things. There's all different explanations. You can go read all the different Mefarshim on Bereshis, all the different commentaries on how the world was created. Kabbalah has its own creation story, not like Genesis. A different story, has a different explanation of how God created the world. Obviously, it's a description of the same act, but from a very different perspective, as we began to learn last week. And this is what it says, chapter 6, page 173. Vehine, Beseder Eshavus Ha'elamis, in the order of the creation of the world, Mimenu Yisbarich, from God may He be blessed. Heidianu Hashem Yisbarich Alidenu V'yenu V'chachamenu HaKadoshim Zal. God, may He be blessed, informed us through His prophets and His holy sages of blessed memory. What does this first line tell us? It tells us that what we're about to say is not something that you could arrive at through mortal intellect. It's not something a person just looking at the world and using logic would arrive at as the story for the world's creation. This is something that can only be known through prophecy, which means it's pure Kabbalah. Kabbalah meaning received wisdom. Kabbalah comes from God. This is what God told us about the process of His creation. There's no way, looking at the world, that you would know this, what we're about to say. As the Arizal says, as the Holy Ari said, the Ari in whom the Spirit of God spoke. In other words, the Arizal says it, it's reliable. Why is it reliable? Because the Arizal only says things that God says, right? When it comes up in God's simple desire to create the world, here already we have questions. What does it mean that it came up? It arose. How can you say that God at one point seemingly did not desire something and then He desired something? What is His simple will, right, as opposed to what exactly, right? What's the adjective simple? When we say it arose in His will, it's a simple will. These are all good questions. I'm just pointing them out. I'm not going to explain them unless Tzemach Tzedek goes there. Livrei Olam, to create the world. He had a simple will to create the world. What did He do? So in the beginning, there was God, and there was God's expression, God's natural expression, God's light, right? Or as we say in Aleinu, there was Him and His name, right? There was Him and His name, Him and His expression, right? Consider His light like the light that radiates off a person when they're in a room. The natural, as we've been explaining, the natural expression of a person. There was God and His light, meaning to say His natural expression of self, His presence, so to speak. His presence which reflected everything that there is about Him. The expression of His perfection, the expression of everything that He was. There was Him and His expression. Just I understand already a difficult concept, but whatever. What did He do? Tzimtzem atzmei menekuda ha'emtzayis. He contracted Himself in a central point. God limited He and His expression into a central point. The center of what? That's a very good question. What was left over when He contracted Himself? It's a very good question. What is the space in which all of this is taking place such that it has a center? It's a very good question. Nevertheless, this is the story. He contracted Himself. What's this point? What does it mean He contracted Himself? Basically, there's no word in this sentence that really stands on its own without further explanation, which is why we're going to explain all of this. God contracted Himself into a central point. He limited His expression. This word tzimtzem, limited or contracted, is going to be relevant to us. We're going to be discussing the tzimtzum, the Kabbalistic idea of the contraction of God's expression. So He limited Himself to a central point. And He left an empty space, an equal space, empty on all sides. So God was in the center, and on all sides He left an empty space, an equal, like an evenly, a makam shaveh means like an even, shaveh means like equal or even. He left an even space on all sides, empty. Rak rishimo nishar sham min ha'or shaya kedem. All that was in that space was the rishimu. Rishimu means remnant, or a trace, he translates here. There was a trace remaining from the light that was before. right? Like, for example, if you write on the example, I think it's even brought in the Mimer, the example is if you write on a piece of paper with a pencil and then you erase the pencil, there's something left, there's a trace, there's a remnant of what was before. So God limited himself into a center of point, and there was an empty space on all sides. What remained in the empty space? Some sort of remnant. There was a remnant of the light. Now, if you ask, well, if the light was the pencil, then what's the paper? What was the light upon, such that there's a remnant in it? It's again a very good question. All that remained was the Rishimu. All that remained was this trace. V'amnam eina b'chinas miut ba'or chas v'shalom. However, there was not a decrease in light, God forbid. This is a very important point in the Arizal's story. The light is removed from the space. Everything is contracted. God and his expression are contracted into a single point. But don't think that the light stopped shining. Don't think that the light went anywhere. There was no cessation in the light. God continued to express himself fully. It's only that he contracted himself into a point. Rak nestalik letzdadim. The light was simply removed to the side, whatever that means, right? The light was pushed away. The light didn't stop shining. This is going to be important, as you'll see. The light didn't stop shining. The light simply was no longer in this space. It was moved to the side. V'achar kach himshich l'seichei kavdak. And afterwards, into this empty space, in which all there was in the empty space was the remnant, the Rishimu, the trace, he drew a single ray of light, a thin ray of that light, right? Remember, the light was, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, like diffuse, right? Infinite, going in all directions at once, emanating from God himself. He moved the light to the side, and into the remnant of what was left from when he removed the light, he shone a single ray of the same light.
Look up.
Yeah, for a kav. That's what it says. So a kavdak, a single ray of light. V'hine, okay, that's basically the explanation. And from this ray of light is created the universe and all the spiritual worlds. That's the Kabbalistic story of creation. How does God create the world? He contracts himself into a single point. He puts his light on the side. All that's left in the empty space all around him is the Rishimu, is the remnant. Into the remnant he shines a single ray of the original light. Not a new light, as we said, it's the same light from before, but he takes one ray from that light and he puts it into the remnant, and that is what creates the universe and all the spiritual worlds. Now the question is, what does any of this mean? Thankfully, the Tzemach Tzedek is here to explain. The first point the Tzemach Tzedek says is like this: V'hine, hishavus hakelim hanal perek, the creation of the vessels, as we've been speaking about, the vessels for the light, right, that we've been speaking about so far, hein min harishimu, the vessels are created from the remnant. Where do the vessels, people kept asking during the class, where do the vessels come from? The answer is, the vessels come from the rishimu, right? The vessels come from the remnant. The Rishimu is the trace from when the light's removed. That is what forms the vessels, is the trace left over from when the light's removed. V'eshavus ha'eres, and the creation of the light, she'ema atzvus del il parakeh, which we've been referring to as God himself in the chapter above. I'm going to remind you what that means in a second. Hamislavish b'kelim, which is invested in the vessels, hu min ha'kav, comes from the kav, comes from the single ray of light. Right? If you'll recall into previous chapters, what's the light in the vessel? Right? We've been explaining that between God and the world, there's a third category called godliness, which is neither creation nor God himself, but is rather an expression of God. It is through this expression of God that God creates the world. We've been focusing on one part of godliness, of God's self-expression, that's not a creation, and that has been the spheres, right? The 10 spheres, the 10 sphirot of Atzilus, right? And particularly we've been focusing on God's knowledge, how it is that God's able to know the creation. And we explained at very great length how basically the most pressing theological questions about how God can both be one and simple and yet know the creation are answered in Kabbalah by the principle of the light in the vessels. right? Long story short, we said, is God infinite, or does he know the finite world, right? Is he one? Is his knowledge one with him? And if so, how does that knowledge become limited? And if his knowledge is separate from him, then how can you say it's his knowledge? And the answer to all of this is the lights and the vessels. The light is God's infinite, unadulterated, pure expression. It is so reflective of God, such that when the light does something, it's as if God does it, right? On the other hand, the vessels are 10, whereas the light is undefined and infinite, the vessels are limited and defined. There's 10 specific spheres, 10 specific vessels, and it's the light interacting with these vessels, like a soul in a body, that through which God creates the world, through which God creates all of the spiritual worlds and the physical world. Comes through the interaction of light and vessels. When we say here, light represented God himself, the essential light. Because in our previous paradigm, we were just saying there's God and then there's the vessels. Here we're clarifying, when we say God in the vessels, we mean God's light in the vessels. It's that the light is so reflective of God that the light is as if God himself, right? Similar, we said, when the light is in the vessel, right, it's just like your soul is in your hand, such that when the hand picks up the wallet, you don't say Tzvi's hand picks up the wallet, you say Tzvi picked up the wallet, because the hand is only a vessel, and through what does the hand act? It acts through the soul, extending itself into the faculty of motion, which allows me to move the wallet. And so through the soul expanding itself into the physical vessel of my hand, like a soul and body, I move the wallet, and that, because my soul is me, because the extension of my soul into my hand is basically completely one with my soul and who I am and my personal identity, we would say that I lifted the wallet, right? And this is essentially how we've been saying, this is how God knows the world. God knows the world, it's God who knows, but God simply gives off a simple, infinite, undifferentiated light. God, in other words, God simply does the action of Godding. God merely expresses himself. It's the vessel that turns that expression of God into knowing specifically, right, as opposed to any of the other spheres, as opposed to kindness, as opposed to severity, right, as opposed to any of the other different things that God could do. It's the vessel which allows him to accomplish this specific action. So the vessel is essentially the half of the interaction that's limited, defined, enumerated, right? It has we can understand what it is to some extent. The light is the aspect which is infinite, completely united with the infinite creator, etc. And somehow, basically, the question we're dealing with now, also at great length, is how is this possible, right? How is it possible that the limited vessels and the infinite light should interact in such a way that the whole thing together becomes one thing that you could call, this is God's knowledge. And it's really knowledge, but it's really God knowing it, right? You have to have both halves. It's a limited act, it's a defined act of God knowing specifically. On the other hand, it's the infinite God who does it, right? You have to have higher and lower together, and this is where they meet. They meet in the vessels, in the spheres of Atzilus, in light and vessels. And the question is, this whole should be reviewed, so to most people, it should sound somewhat familiar at least. And the question is, how can the two interact? So basically, we're telling this we've told this creation story. And we've said the vessels of the spheres, where do they come from? What's their original source? All of this whole story we've told is before the creation of the spheres. Before even the spheres. Basically, all of this is taking place, so to speak, it seems, in God's light, or at least at a place higher than the spheres. We may get into more detail later. So in other words, where do the spheres themselves come from? And the answer is, they derive from two different aspects of God's light. The light in the spheres comes from the ray, which is called the kav, kav just means like a line, or a ray, that God sends into the remnant of where all of the light was previously. The remnant is called the reshimu. So you have kav, which is the ray, and the reshimu, which is the remnant or the trace. And it is the ray, which is the source of the light in the spheres, and the trace and the remnant, which is the source of the vessels. So the vessels, the limitation, the limiting aspect, the defining aspect of the spheres is derived from this reshimu, which is very mysterious, this trace that's left over for when the light is withdrawn. And the kav is the ray that is sent into the reshimu, the single ray of God's light. And that's the source of the light that's within the spheres. This is what we're saying. Ulefi pshutei, and according to the simple understanding of all of this, says the Tzemach Tzedek, last line on page 172, hadavar ploi, the matter is astonishing. It's wondrous. This is very hard to understand. What is Tzemach Tzedek? Top of page 175. How is it possible that there can be a limitation and a removal to the side of God's infinite light, she'en lo musaguf, which certainly does not have any resemblance to a body, right? When we say infinite light, we mean we're very serious about how infinite it is. It's very, very infinite, right? We don't mean petty human infinities such as we can even imagine, right? We don't mean like the infinite numbers of which we can perhaps have some grasp or some pretense of understanding. The Or Ein Sof, as I explained in a previous class, is not just it's not just the infinitude of everything that we understand. It is the full expression of everything that God can do. God being utterly and completely infinite in every way. So in other words, not only is contained in Or Ein Sof everything that's within our world, to an infinite extent, what is contained within Or Ein Sof is everything in all possible and all impossible worlds. Whatever that means, right? You can try and wonder what everything, not everything that is and not everything that can be, but also everything that can't be is also in God's infinite light, right? We figure out what that means sometime. Then what we say is, but God takes this light and He moves it to the side. It's like it's not it's like we describe it as a very simple, almost physical motion. The Tzemach Tzedek's question is if you have something that's truly this manner and form of infinitude, not only is it infinite, but it's also one, and it's completely united. And we know that God doesn't have anything resembling a body. So there's certainly no physical space in which this can take place, and there's certainly no physical place which can even hold this form of infinitude. This God's infinite light precedes the entire notion of space. So what does it mean that the light is moved to the side, right? What is this? It's obviously metaphorical. There's obviously no side. The question is, why? What does the metaphor mean? What is the Arizal trying to tell us by this language? Yes, the question's clear? V'gam sha'kasuv emer ani avaya le'shanisi. Also, the verse says, and we've had this verse in previous weeks, that I, Hashem, did not change. I, God, did not change in the creation of the world. God remains essentially unchanged from before the creation and once the world is created. God is essentially unchanged, whatever that means. And the tzimtzum and this contraction of light, this idea that before, right, here's how we're describing it. We seem to be describing it that before God decided to create the world, He filled the space, whatever that means, right? He was completely expressed, he had complete self-expression, and then He contracted Himself into one point such that an empty space was allowed on all sides. And then the creation of the world is He only brought in one ray of that light in order to create the world. This sounds like a huge difference from before and after, even if we don't really understand what it means. But the point is that even in the description, even in the metaphor that we don't understand, the metaphor still seems to imply that there's a massive change before God decides to create the world, whatever that means, time also not existing. That's a separate issue. Before, so to speak, God decides to create the world, and after He decides to create the world and He contracts Himself, there seems to be a massive difference. And the world is created within this empty space from a single ray of the light. In other words, it's not like the creation of the world even returns back to the status quo before the world's creation. It seems that there's a permanent, at least as long as the world exists, there's a permanent change in the status quo, in the way things are. Before, God was completely self-expressed. Now He's contracted Himself into a point, and it's only a single ray which creates the entire world. There seems to be a massive change in the status quo. There seems to be a change due to the creation of the world. So our first question is, what does it mean that the light can be put on the side? What does this very physical metaphor actually mean? The second question is, how do we square this whole thing away with God not changing, seemingly with the creation of the world? There's a massive change, right? These are our two questions. We'll find the answer according to what we said before in chapter 5, explaining the term Or Ein Sof, God's infinite light. What does God's infinite light refer to? What do we mean when we say the light? We're referring to the ray which radiates from Him according to His simple will, His simple desire. We did clarify in a previous week that this is not referring to the desire, which is sometimes referred to as the sphira of Keser. We don't mean Ratzon as it relates to the 10 spheres. We mean the higher Ratzon. That's actually, chances are, that's actually the emphasis of Ratzon HaPashut. That's why the Tzemach Tzedek is saying his simple will, to distinguish it from the will that comes later. There's another thing that's called will in Kabbalah that comes later. This is before all that. This is the will simply to express his infinite light. Shalafi Sha'orim Enamar, since this light is representative of the source, reflects the source, L'chein hu ein sof. That is why it is infinite, right? As I said before, the whole idea of the light is that it's the full expression of everything that God is. That's what we mean by light. When we say Or Me'ein Amar, the light reflects the source, we mean specifically that it's like the sun. God is not tailoring a specific expression. Rather, this is the quote unquote natural expression of God.
So where's the will here?
What?
If it's natural,
No, but it's by will. No, but it's by will. It's naturally, but it's by will, right? And only God can have both. But we say in the Maskana, that's what God has. It's by will, but it's as if we have to think of it like it's naturally, because we don't understand how it can be by will and also be a full expression of the self. Right, so we have to use both mashalim, sort of, and try and, even though in our head, because in the world this concept doesn't really exist, that it should be a willful expression, but it's not willful in a way that it's actually designed or tailored for anything. He's not willfully expressing himself in a certain way. Rather, it's as if the light coming off the sun, it's simply the expression of everything that he is, as if it's natural. Right, that's the idea. That's what we mean that the light is reflective of the source. Just like when you look at the sun, you so to speak, you know that the sun's not holding back, right, so to speak, right? What I mean is that the sun is not making the light for the observer. When you look at the sun, you don't think, oh, the sun's just showing me the white light now because it knows I'm looking, but when I turn my back, the sun's going to be green, right? For example, right? It's a stupid thing to say, not only because the sun is more or less inanimate, but also because the sun's inanimate is actually also not so simple. Whatever. But whatever. The idea that the sun should be green when we turn around is ridiculous, because the sun does not express light because it's trying to please the observer. The sun expresses light because that's what the sun naturally does. So too with Or Ein Sof, when we say light reflects God, God's light reflects him, the infinite light reflects him, we mean that he's not willfully expressing the light to accomplish anything, so to speak. It's by will, he is willfully expressing it, but it's not limited the way it would be if we were. It's as if it's a natural expression of God. It's as if simply everything that he is fully expressed. That's what we have to have in mind when we think of the infinite light. And the light, that's why the light reflects the source. That's why it's called light. Right? That's the whole idea. That's why we call it light, because we want to understand fully that everything that he is in this light. He's fully reflected, fully expressed. Kamei, 3 lines up from the bottom of page 175. Kamei Shatzmusi is Barich, just as he himself, may he be blessed, Ein le tchila v'tichla, does not have a beginning or an end, right? And we know there's a rule in Chassidus, Kol sheyesh le tchila yesh le tichla. Everything that has a beginning has an end, right? So God certainly has no end, and therefore he certainly has no beginning. V'lechein nikra Or Ein Sof. However, this light is called only the light without end. Right? It's called specifically the Or Ein Sof, which we normally translate as the infinite light, but literally translated means the light without end. Right? We do not call the light as having no beginning, right? Because if we said that only God has no beginning, the light is a full expression of what he is, but what is it ultimately? It's an expression of him, which means to say it has a beginning. He being the source of the illumination, the illumination is the tchila, is the beginning of the light. God himself is not an expression of anything. God simply is. God is God, right? That's the famous thing. He simply is himself. Everything else has a beginning. God is the only thing that doesn't have a beginning. That's why when we say the infinite light, we use specifically the language, the light without end. The light is an infinite expression of God, but it has a beginning, it has a source. The light is created by God. The light exists only to express God. The only thing which has no beginning and no end is God. Everything else has a beginning, so to speak. When we say beginning, we don't mean necessarily in time, which is a very coarse, almost, and physical way of thinking of what we mean by beginning. We mean even qualitatively having a beginning. We mean that even if the light has existed forever, its existence is qualitatively, what does it exist to do? It exists to express God and is dependent on God in every way. So qualitatively, the nature of the light, by nature of its being light, it doesn't have it has a beginning. It only doesn't have an end. Right? That's the general idea. It's simply because it is an extension and an expression of the ray that we call it ein sof le'espashtus, that it has no end to its expression, right? In other words, it goes on forever. Qualitatively, it has the quality that it expresses everything that God is, but it's not at the same level of infinitude that He is. It has a beginning.
So it never gets used up.
It certainly never gets used up. No, that's for sure not. So that's what the light is. It is in this light that we had the aforementioned contraction. The contraction is not in God Himself, God forbid. What does this mean? Again, this is important. This is actually distinctive of the Chassidic doctrine. There have been other rabbis in history who have vociferously disagreed. Even contemporaries of Chassidus have one of the original disagreements theologically between the Misnagdim, the opponents of Chassidus, and the Chassidim was in this idea. Whether the Tzimtzum, it's actually a slightly different idea, but we're leading into it. The first question is whether the Tzimtzum is a Tzimtzum in God, or is it Tzimtzum only in His light and in His expression? Again, whether the Tzimtzum, this limitation, when God withdraws into this one point, do we mean that God Himself withdraws from the whole picture, from the empty space, or do we mean only that He withdraws His light? This is the first point of disagreement. Here we are saying, Chassidus' position is that God only withdraws His light. He does not withdraw Himself. What do we mean by that? Pirush v'inyan hatzimtzum hainu. So what's this withdrawal? When we say He withdraws His light, what do we mean? Page 177 at the top. Okay. What is the tzimtzum? Being that the potential extension of this ray, which we're calling Ein Sof, which we're calling God's infinite expression, God's infinite light, it is able to shine without any limitation or end at all. Right? It's able to shine indefinitely in the being that it's the fullest expression of everything that God is. Just as God is infinite, so too the infinite light is also infinite. It also has no end. Therefore, this is very important. This is like Chassidus' whole perspective in one line. The light would not be able to create limited beings as we have them now in our world. Again, the infinite light would not be able to create limited beings as we have them now in our world. What's the first thing we see? The first thing we see is that the nature of the Ein Sof and the nature of the Tzimtzum is for the purpose of the creation. What we're describing is not something that God does for His own ends, so to speak, at least not directly. Rather, it's something that He does in order that the creation should be the way it is now. In other words, we're talking about all these high things and about God's infinite light before the creation of the world, but really what is in the driver's seat, what is making all of this happen is the world as we know it, the limited physical world, the limited creation, is really what's in the driver's seat. It is the end goal of a physical creation that drives this entire process. So in other words, this is what we say in the Chadodi, right? That No.
To ring the cedar?
No, what's the language in Hebrew? So, sorry.
Which one is it?
He says, basically we say that the end of the thing, the end, soif davar, b'machshava tchila, the last thing, the end of the matter is in the thought first, right? This is what's being described in the Lecha Dodi that we say on Friday night. The end of the thing, the creation of the physical world, is what he had first in mind, because as we're going to see, these highest of all spiritual actions that God performs is all for not just to create any world, not just to create something, but to create specifically the limited creation with which we are familiar. All of this that we're describing is basically in order to create a world that must fulfill certain parameters that our world fulfills, is the long story short. God had a desire to create a certain type of world. In order to create that type of world, God had to, so to speak, do certain actions. To the extent you could say God has to do anything. It's a discussion for maybe a different time. Sort of.
So he introduced the Balgvul into the Bilti Balgvul.
God would not be, the infinite light was not able to create a limited creation like we have now. If you went directly, we've actually spoken about this before in previous class, just in different words. If you went directly from God's infinitude to the creation would be by nature infinite and part of the Creator, right? What was the example? How did we describe this previously? We described this previously as that there's a subjective and an objective reality, right? We described it as there's God as He knows Himself, and then there is a world He knows that's outside of Him. That's, so to speak, an objective reality that is not known the way He knows Himself, but is known as something outside of Himself, so to speak. Right? So too it is with human beings, right? We each have a subjective reality that no one can know, and then there's an objective reality that we all share, right? We explained this in the context of the difference between emunah and seichel, right? Emunah, faith, is the capacity of the soul to know God subjectively, right? Is basically to know God as God knows Himself, is to know God at a level that cannot be shared objectively, as opposed to knowledge, which is the objective pursuit of God, the objective understanding of the Creator. Right, and we explained in previous classes. The same idea is here. The Ein Sof, the expression of God, the infinite expression of God, is basically an extension of His subjective reality. Is an expression of His I. When God says Anechi, when God says at the beginning of the Ten Commandments, I am the Lord your God. Right? This expression of God, this infinite expression of God, is an extension of His I, God's extension of His self-conception. From His self-conception, with no other intervening process, if He simply in His self-conception said, I will create a reality, it's not very different than a person sitting and imagining inside of his head a reality. I'm imagining a unicorn, right? What reality does the unicorn have separate from my mind in any obvious way? The answer is it doesn't at all, right? Even if you could get inside my head and see the unicorn, you would see the unicorn is part of Tzvi's mind in a very direct way. That's literally what it's made of, right? God didn't want to create a world that literally is made of God in the obvious appearance, right? Even more, the truth is that this is even higher than this. That not only would it be made of God, so to speak, but the world that wouldn't just be the ground of the reality, but the reality itself. What would it express? It would express God's infinitude. You wouldn't be able to have something that could be. You wouldn't be able to have a table that has a separate identity as a table, that has an objective reality to itself as a table. Everything would be, you'd see the table and you'd see, oh, that's an infinite part of God's expression. It's the aspect of God's infinite expression. That's the aspect of table you would see if the Or Ein Sof created the world. If the world was created simply from Or Ein Sof with no process whatsoever. Now, there's a caveat to all of this, if you haven't thought of the question already.
You're going to see that anyway.
That's a separate issue. This is before the creation is like the anti-Mashiach. That's 1 second. We're not there yet. The question I was thinking of is ultimately God could do anything without a process, right? Because
Yeah.
God has no limitation, especially in the Chassidic understanding. God has absolutely no limitation. God could create the world in such a way that there is no process, and yet the world is absolutely limited and objective and separate from Himself, right? If God wills it, then it can be. There's several different explanations for why it's not so. All of them are difficult to understand. I'll just give one quick thought about the idea, which is that if the creation process of creating the thing, even if God, there's just God by His will creates a limited table, right? This is the entire universe. He creates a universe that consists of this room and a table in it, right? There's a table. The table is, because God wills it, the table is limited, the table is defined, the table has its own existence, it's objective, and God is able to do all of this without any process, without a light, and without a tzimtzum, and God just decides that there should be a table. But the thing is that anything whose creation story, who the process of creating it is simply God desiring to create it, the question is, how limited and how distant is this thing from God ultimately? Right? This is something that a person has to consider. Even though its nature would be that it's completely limited, nevertheless, what is the process of its creation? Directly by God's will. It's created directly, simply because God willed it. It simply popped into reality with no explanation whatsoever. The answer is, things that pop into reality with no explanation whatsoever, how distant are they truly from a creator? On the contrary, things that pop into reality with no explanation whatsoever are unbelievably godly. It's impossible to escape the idea that God created them. The idea that there's a process and that the process passes through different hands puts in a certain intellectual extension, right? Even though, because ultimately what we're talking about is not a difference in the true reality of the thing, which is limited because God wants it to be limited. We're talking about a difference intellectually, and the intellect grasping the thing. And long story short, this is part of why the explanation is so difficult. The way the intellect grasps the thing, the way a human being understands the thing and understands how God creates it, is itself supposed to be part of the limitation of the thing. This is the general idea. It's a little hard to wrap your mind around. It needs more explanation. But long story short, the way the thing is created, and that we should understand the way the thing is created, is not really a limited creation of this world unless it's created through a process, because by nature this world is a world of process. Right? You could say God, and then you could do infinitely, right? You could say, well, He could just make it a world of process without a process. Why not have a process without having a process from God? And the answer is, well, what's a process that's not created from a process, right? And so on infinitely, right? I'm not saying the answers to this are very easy to understand. I'm just saying that there are explanations in Chassidus for this idea that the world had to be created through a process, not because God needed it, but because the world to be a world needed to be created through a process. Yeah? It's the whole Shari Chudumah. Okay, sorry for that detour. Is anyone still with me in any way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's very helpful actually.
Okay. So the world, long story short, God contracts His infinite light. Why does it contract the infinite light? Because the infinite light can only, by nature, can only create an infinite reality. God decides He doesn't want an infinite reality, He wants a limited reality. In order to do that, to create a limited reality...
Wait, why can't the infinite light make limited beings? Because He's God, He can do it, like He can cause it to...
The infinite light is not God, first of all. The infinite light is just God and its expression of everything that He is. That's important.
Isn't that a limitation?
What?
If it's a limitation on the light, then there might be a limitation on God. If the infinite light can't create limited beings.
The infinite light does create limited beings, but through a process.
Okay, so again with the process.
The idea is that there's going to be a tzimtzum, which is the tzimtzum is what allows the infinite light to create a limited being. The infinite light before the tzimtzum, it's not a
limitation.
It's not a limitation in the conventional sense, but the point is that the whole idea that God in his infinitude doesn't have a limitation is something that applies to God himself, not the light as it is at any particular level of expression. God himself has no limitations. The infinite light, it turns out, is not God himself. The infinite light is the infinite light. The infinite light has the limitation, so-called, of being infinite, right? At least according to what we're saying here, it has the limitation of being infinite. It's so to speak limited. It's not really a limitation, right? In any intellectual sense of the term limitation, the limitation of being infinite is not a limitation. On the contrary, you would only be taking away.
Behaves.
No, it's how it behaves, but you would only be taking away from it by creating a world from it.
So would it be like electricity when it comes from the plant? There's no limitation to it, but we can't handle it.
Yes,
so
it is
the
like
transformers have to dial it down
Yes.
so we can actually interact with it.
That's a good metaphor. It is something like that. But the point is that how can you say that the light has the infinite power of God and is not able to express itself in a limited form, right? He's saying, according to the highest definition of infinitude, that anything should be possible. The point is that under the traditional understanding, that's a very Hasidic perspective. Under the traditional understanding of infinitude, under the logical understanding of infinitude, right, that God can do anything is not an expression of infinitude. How much time do we have? 5 minutes. The idea that God can do everything is not a traditional expression of infinitude. Right? The idea that God can do anything is an anti-intellectual, ridiculous idea. The idea that God can do anything. It's preposterous. The idea that God can do anything. It's completely ridiculous. It is. It's completely intellectual ridiculousness, right? Like if you say, right, the idea, as the Rambam could explain to you much better than I could explain to you, but as the Rambam would explain to you, the idea that God could make 2 + 2 = 5, right? And you say, so you ask, could God make 2 + 2 = 5? Or could God create a rock so heavy that he couldn't lift it? Or could God microwave a taco so hot that he couldn't eat it? Right? It's the same idea over and over. It depends who you hear the question from. You hear different versions, but depends how intellectual they are. But it's the same question over and over. What Chassidus tells you is the answer to that question is something very hard to understand. What the Rambam tells you the answer to that question is that you're an idiot for asking it, right? The whole idea that 2 + 2 should = 5 is a nonsensical idea. The idea that God should have the potential to create things that contradict logic is preposterous, right? When you don't even have a conception of what it means to be high enough that you could be illogical. On the contrary, in your conception, in intellect, right, you cannot explain to me why to not have a mind is a higher thing than having a mind, and you can't explain to me why violating logic is a higher thing than acting according to logic, right? In fact, that's the whole definition of intellect. The whole in other words, as part of your limitation in being able to even think about it, you can't explain to me why going against logic is a higher thing, is a quality. On the contrary, going against logic, contradicting logic, is a lack. It's a chisaron, right? It's something that you don't marry someone because they're illogical, right? You marry someone because they're illogical, so metaphorically speaking. So the whole idea that it's an advantage of God, that it adds to his infinitude, that he should be able to do anything is ridiculous, right? You have no conception of such an infinitude. You can't explain to me why that's a good thing, right? You can only explain to me why he being the highest thing logically, the highest thing within intellect, the greatest and most perfect of all beings, upon whom all depends, and he depends on nothing else. You can explain that God to me. A God who can just do anything is an inexplicable God. And therefore, by definition, is a ridiculous God. That's why the idea is ridiculous and preposterous. You can't explain to me why that's an advantage, right? Why that's a good thing. It's a similar idea here. When you say God can do anything, so how is the infinite light not limited to... God can do anything is a separate rule that applies specifically to God, and it's a very Hasidic understanding. In traditional understanding, what you should think about when you think of God's infinite light is not something that can do anything. You should think of something that is the perfection of everything. On the contrary, creating a limited reality only takes away from that perfection. To actually have a physical table is not adding to the infinitude. It's only a subtraction. It's only taking away. You're only taking away from God's infinite expression to limit him to one specific thing. Right? The idea that the infinite light should be able to create a finite reality means that it's not really infinite. The highest and most perfect expression of God is that expression which is not limited in any way, right? And how do you know that it's highest? Because only God could have such an expression. Only God can express himself in such a way that it not only contains within it all possibilities and everything that exists, but everything that can't exist. And you're telling me that he should trade that for some limited, specific, defined expression? It only takes away from God.
Don't trade it simultaneously.
Huh?
When we say
there's no simultaneously. How can you have two opposites simultaneously? That's like having 2 and 2 and having it equal 5.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying.
You can.
Yes.
That's exactly what I'm saying. That's
what
I'm saying is that's not an explanation. That's not an intellectual explanation. That's not an intellectual explanation.
That's what we say in the Amidah every day.
Because you live in a world that's saturated with Chassidus, and you've learned Chassidus, and you know that's something which is possible, but it's not something you can explain. It's not something which makes any sense. You can't say that's a mila of God. You can't say that's a quality that God has, that he can be both finite and infinite at the same time.
So what does it mean? Agadol Vanoa?
Yeah, what does it mean?
Agadol means that he wants to express himself infinitely. Agibor, Akoveshet Yitzro, then within it.
No, different times in different ways. Different expressions of God. What's this at the same time? It's either infinite or it's not infinite. First there's infinite and then there's not infinite.
But you can't say God is something at a certain point and is something different at a different point.
You say the world is. Yeah. The world, as the world perceives his expression, but God is unchanging in one. I'm explaining to you the logical explanation of God. Don't come to me with Chassidus now and say it's both at the same time. You could say it is. You could say they're both at the same time about everything. You could say...
Everybody says that.
So go read the Rambam's explanation. It's not how you're saying. I promise.
Okay.
I promise. Go read the philosophical explanation of these ideas, of what it means that God has different things. You could ask the same question, how could God create a chair and a table? There's only one God. Well, how is there two different expressions?
This is perceived. But what he is and what we perceive, it's two different things.
No, it's not perception. There is a chair and there is a table, but there's only one God. How's that possible?
How is it possible that nothing is separate?
I'm saying there's answers to these things. People ask these questions before the idea came around that anybody thought it was even logical to imagine that God could do just anything, right? I don't think that Judaism is logical. You understand? I'm not defending this ultimately. I'm saying you're right, but you're wrong in terms of the question. The question is not an intellectual question. Is basically the point I'm pointing out. This idea that God can do, when you hear Or Ein Sof, what you should hear and think initially, at least, right? The logical perspective for you to have is that it's infinite, and any finitude is only a detraction from it. Obviously, because only God can be Ein Sof. Only God can be infinite. Right? What is gained by having a limited creation? On the contrary, all there could possibly be is a detraction. You limit what's impossible. You only do what's possible. You only do a specific thing that's possible. You create the world as it is. This is a massive limitation on God's infinite expression. This is a bit of a diversion, but I felt the last 5 minutes. You have to be able to separate these things if you really want to appreciate what's going on, right? Because half of the problem with learning Chassidus, half of the difficulty is that you have to understand how to read it. What I mean by that is that different ideas and different parts are speaking to different parts of the neshama, right? We're learning a whole discourse about how we have at least two different ways of approaching God. We have intellect and we have emunah, right? And it's important to not mix up what's for what. It's important to realize that where the lines are, what we're really saying, right? And if you want to follow the Tzemach Tzedek logically to his conclusion, right, you can ask literally, this is like you could almost state it as a Chassidic axiom. On any question in the universe, you could ask, but God can do anything. On literally anything. 2 + 2 = 4. How do you know God can do anything? Who told you? When was the last time you checked? God could do anything. Maybe he changed it since the last time you looked, right? It's a problem. To start out with the idea that God can do anything is both an incredible advantage. It's like starting at the top of the mountain. It's also an incredible disadvantage because that totally closes your mind to the entire process we're working through, right? It's like, why did the Tzemach Tzedek even bother writing a mimer? He could have just said God can do anything. Have faith. Right?
He should have, because
can have that argument out with him. It's not my fault. But
you want a class to be easy.
But it's a little more complicated than that. So long story short, and let's just sum up here. I know we're over time. We did start late though. So we have this infinite light, which is the expression of all God is, and the tzimtzum takes place according to the Chabad perspective, the way that Tzemach Tzedek is saying. The contraction takes place only within the light. The contraction takes place not within God himself. God is not removed from anything. It's only his expression which is removed. What does it mean for God to even have a presence without any expression?
It's what we feel now every day.
Yeah, isn't that comforting? So you have to. It's a good question. It's a good question. God never removes himself, but what is God without the light? Right? Everything that we know is made out of the light, so to speak, or so it seems. Everything we know is created from an expression of God. God himself, without the expression, however, never removed himself from anything. He never removed himself from any of the reality. Right? And Tzimtzum's only in the light, whatever that means. We're going to keep talking about it, but that's quite a heavy. There's a lot of heavy ideas, and they're coming like very fast here. But that's another idea. The Tzimtzum contracted this light. What was the purpose of the Tzimtzum? The purpose of the Tzimtzum was because we wanted to create a limited world. God's infinite light, barring his ability to do anything, putting that aside for a moment, God's infinite light, as it was in the status quo before the world was created, so to speak, only had the ability to create infinitely. It was all of reality was only subjective. There was no room. And when we say room, we mean in a qualitative sense. We mean in a spiritual sense. Like you say, someone argued a case so well that there was no room for objection. There was no room for argument. So in that sense, right, but much more powerfully, there was no room for any objective reality to exist when there was God's infinite light, because there was God, and everything that could possibly or could not possibly be was expressed in his infinite light. What room is there for an objective reality outside of God to exist in that? Absolutely none. So even if the infinite light were to create, so to speak, what would it create? It would create something like itself. It would be a further expression of God's subjectivity. You wouldn't be able to have a separate entity. Everything would be one with God. If God, in an open and in the most open and revealed way, right? The table would not be a table. The very word table would mean God's infinitude. And you wouldn't be able to find any words in the dictionary if all that there was Ein Sof directly creating, so to speak, without the process of its tzimtzum. You wouldn't find any words in the dictionary that would mean anything other than God's infinite expression. That's what all the words in the dictionary would be defined as, so to speak. Right? That's the idea. So why did God create a tzimtzum? In order that there should be a limited creation. And we're going to continue our explanation of the story in much more length and with more explanation, God willing, next week.
Yeah. And we're also going to have a review.